Okay, let's take a quick look at some of our drawing materials. This conversation is really focused on beginning drawing students, but it's not to say that more intermediate and advanced students might not benefit from this conversation as well as the demo I'm about to give. For my beginning drawing students, we've been up to this point working with graphite pencils drawing linearly. From this point forward, we're going to be working with charcoal, and we're going to be using our charcoal to create value drawings, tonal value drawings. The reason we're using charcoal for this stage is because it's a little bit more forgiving, it's a little easier to move around and to blend. And that'll come up when I show you some very particular methods on how to do that in a few minutes during the demo. But at first, let's just talk about some of these materials really quickly. So first of all, I generally urge my students to start with Willow Charcoal. You can start your drawing with any charcoal that you want. You can start with compressed charcoal, you can start with Willow Charcoal, Vine Charcoal. The big difference between Willow and Vine Charcoal, and you'll see that I tend to use the pure Willow Charcoal, is the big difference is that most Vine Charcoal has some additives in it. Without getting into details, the additives are like a binder, and they tend to create a little bit more of a scratchy, brittle feeling in the charcoal. I personally like more of a buttery, softer feeling when I'm working with the softer Willow Charcoal, so I tend to go with pure Willow Charcoal. Once I have them out, I will break them up into smaller pieces that are a little bit more manageable. So when you pull the stick out, they're about 4 or 5 inches, and sometimes that's a little overwhelming for students. Just break them up, no problem. Break them into smaller pieces, and it's a little bit easier to deal with that way. And you can also sharpen your Willow Charcoal. I tend not to. Occasionally I might, but if you really want to, you can use some sandpaper. Here I have a little sandpaper paddle. These are great tools. You can just use straight sandpaper from the hardware store. These are nice. They sell them in these little pads with about 12 or 15 pieces of sandpaper. And you can use those not only sharpen your Willow Charcoal sticks, but you can use those to sharpen your pencils to a really like a needle fine point if you want. Once the drawing is underway and you have a pretty good grasp of where you want the objects and you want the general shape and scale, the Willow Charcoal is, you can continue. You can make an entire drawing from start to finish with Willow Charcoal. Absolutely beautiful. It's very delicate. It's very, 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 very mysterious. It's also very easy to smudge and smear, which is part of its beauty, but it's also part of it can be very frustrating for artists because it's really very fragile, and if you just sneeze on it, sometimes you'll blow half of the drawing away. So be aware that the Willow Charcoal is very dusty, and it is very, very fragile and very ethereal, very beautiful. When you feel like you want to make your marks a little bit more permanent and a little bit darker, the compressed charcoal sticks and pencils are your next step. So I would always start with your Willow Charcoal, then you can go to your compressed sticks or compressed charcoal pencils. Now, there are thousands of different brands. These tend to be what I get my students. These are generals. I also have some other compressed charcoal pencils that I picked up along the way. Some of these are from China. Some of these are just, I don't even know where I got half of these. So lots of different kinds of charcoal, but as in your graphite pencils here, you'll see your charcoal pencils have a range of hardness to softness. Here you have extra super soft, which would be like a 6B or an 8B, all the way through HB, which is sort of medium, and then up to your H's, 2H, 4H, H. It tends to be harder. The harder the pencil, again, the more resilient the mark will be. It'd be easier to blend. A softer pencil, harder to erase the harder pencil. So the softer pencil is easier to blend, easier to erase. They tend to have less control in some ways, and the harder pencil will tend to be a little bit more permanent, really, and oftentimes a bit easier to get very, very fine detail. So there are a number of other reasons to use harder versus softer and vice versa, but these are some basic overviews. Once you get into your drawing, you're going to want to start thinking about blending. You can use lots of different tools to blend. I use my hands all the time. You can use your fingers. These are paper blending stumps. They are invaluable, very, very important. I'll show you how to use these in a few minutes. You can use Q-tips. You can use a chamois. Artist chamois looks like this when it's new generally, but this particular chamois has been worked. You can use a chamois for erasing, for blending, all sorts of different things. The reason why a lot of teachers or artists recommend not using your hands to blend charcoal is because the oils from your hands can tend to get onto the paper and create a little bit of an oil slick, like a resist on the surface of the paper, and then it's very difficult for that charcoal to adhere into the fibers of the paper. You'd have to work pretty hard at getting that oil into the paper to create a serious resist. If you're putting some kind of moisturizing lotion on your hands or something like that, then yeah, you'll get sort of a slick surface and it might be hard to get the charcoal to do what you want. That said, I use my hands to blend all the time. Also, you'll want to think about erasers. So just a vinyl eraser is fine. The problem with vinyl erasers is that they tend to leave those little eraser shavings behind. I only really use two kinds of vinyl erasers when charcoal is my medium. The one that I use most regularly is this little mechanical eraser. It's just like a mechanical pencil, but it's an eraser. Amazing for details. You can use these to erase little highlights on an eye or hair, shiny reflective objects. These are great for those little details. You can also shave those down with your blade. The more important eraser, though, is your kneaded eraser. They look like this out of the package, but they're called kneaded because you need them. Well, you need them and you need them. So you need them like dough, essentially, to self-clean. You'll notice as you start to fold it, it turns lighter. And as you knead it over and over, and you pull it and you twist it, and it's hard to do with one hand, but as you pull it, you'll start to see that it turns lighter, and you get this self-cleaning action. Really important with charcoal because charcoal, you'll notice, gets really, really messy, and you'll get this eraser to look like a big piece of, I don't even want to say it out loud, but it almost looks like a piece of charcoal itself. That's actually a kneaded eraser that's just filthy. It happens quickly. You make a couple of eraser marks and that charcoal builds right up on top of that eraser and it starts to slide and it won't erase anymore. So as you're using this, keep kneading it and it'll self-clean. And these things last for a long time. They do dry out eventually, but they're good for a while. Now, in terms of sharpening your pencils, you'll notice that these pencils have a long point. I sharpen them much differently than when you buy a pencil and they generally come with a little teeny point like this, or sometimes no point at all. The problem with these for drawing is that you're limited to just that tiny little point, and you're limited to what type of mark making you can achieve. Here, with this long point, what you'll end up seeing is that with a single mark, a single stroke, if I come in at an angle, I can get a very wide mark, and I can get a very calligraphic approach. So in a single mark, you can get a variety of width. The other thing that's nice about coming in at an angle like this is that it allows you a much softer approach to getting a sense of tone or value. If you're always subjected to the point and all you'll have is just very scratchy lines, and that's fine sometimes, but it is not what you always want with your charcoal. So the other nice thing about sharpening your pencils with a long point is that you don't have to sharpen them as often. I tend to use these types of utility knives. These are great. The longer the blade, the easier it is to sharpen. It gives you a nice long cut. Just cut away from the pencil, don't cut towards your hand. I hope that's obvious. If you don't have one of these types of box cutters are okay as well. A little shorter, a little more tedious, but they still work. I would not recommend sharpening or trying to sharpen these charcoal pencils in a regular pencil sharpener. They will disintegrate. They do, however, make pencil sharpeners that are designed for making longer points with softer pencils like charcoal. Those are expensive, and I have not yet found one that actually gives me the same quality I want in my pencil as far as a point. And it's just unnecessary. You can get a $4 blade and a $2 piece of sandpaper and you're good to go. Obviously use your sandpaper to shave down or sand down your point to a very, 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 very fine point if you want to. This other tool out here that I have is an old sock. This is an old gym sock, but you can use any piece of cloth, and you can fill these cloths with some charcoal powder. You can get these at Jerry's Arama or Dick Blick or any of the art supply stores. These charcoal powders jars are nice. You can use them to tone your paper. You can fill these socks with that powder, and in a minute I'll show you how to use this. Traditionally that's called a pounce, and I'll go through how to use that to create nice soft atmospheric marks on your drawing in a few moments. So I think that's pretty much everything we've covered that we really need to look at. Q-tips are great for blending stumps, charcoal pencils. These pencil extenders are really nice. If you start getting your pencil down to a little nub, these little extenders are quite nice. You should have a couple of those kicking around, and that's really all you'll need. So let's take a quick look at our setup. Let's talk briefly about your setup. As we're getting into drawing with value, the setup is going to be even more important. One of the things you'll notice here is that I have a pretty elaborate setup. It's not crazy, but first of all, I don't expect most of y'all to have easels at home. If you do, that's wonderful. If you don't, no sweat. Easels are amazing. There really is no substitute for a good easel. There are a lot of reasons why artists for hundreds of years have worked on easels and have worked flat on a vertical surface, vertical being the key word. I'll talk about that in a second. If you don't have an easel, don't sweat it. I'll talk a little bit about how to set up your situation so you can still draw comfortably, especially given the fact that you have larger pieces of paper now. You'll notice this piece of paper here on my drawing board is the same size that I asked you all to get, 18 by 24. This happens to be this paper here. This is the Strathmore 400 series, but you know, it's not imperative that you use that exact paper. That just happens to be the paper that I like to use for my students. I use it all the time in my studio practice. There are millions of kinds of paper out there. Some are good for charcoal, some not so good. We'll talk about that in a moment. But really, the main thing I want to talk about is the importance of working vertically. In order to do so, when you have your pad of paper, you'll notice, of course, that the pad is kind of bendy and can get very awkward. Some students will tend to work right on the table or something, and that's not terrible if you're working with smaller drawings. Problem with working flat on a horizontal surface is that as you start to work a larger scale, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to keep an eye on your perspective, and the proportions of your drawing will become skewed because you're looking at it on a flat horizontal surface. And so it's very, very difficult to get a sense for accurate proportions when you're looking at it already existing in a sense of perspective. So that's a challenge. That's one of the main reasons artists work vertically, whether it's on the wall or on an easel or on a drawing bench. The other nice thing about working vertically is that I can have my objects set up here, like I have my two spheres, and then as I work, I can at the same time have my drawing or painting in the same eye shot as my objects. So I don't have to go from looking at a flat object to looking straight into a vertical plane. So it really helps see proportions. It really helps see your perspective correctly. Now, if you don't have an easel, of course, how do you deal with that? Well, you can go and purchase a drawing board. And some of these things they're masonite, and they have these built-on little clips that will hold your paper. They're not bad. They're a little heavy. They're not terrible. They're certainly nicer than a piece of plywood, smoother and lighter. They have a little handle. They sell these at the bookstore. They seem smooth, but what you'll notice is that if you start to blend your charcoal with these particular drawing boards, you will get a texture, almost like a gravestone, headstone rubbing texture, relief texture on the paper, not always desired. I have here, and I tend to like to use this in my studio, foam core. This is all dented up because it's been beat up a little bit, but the area under the drawing paper is nice and smooth. The nice thing about foam core, I also tend to use the half-inch thick. You can get foam core in 1/8 inch thick or 1/4 inch thick, but it's really super light, really easy to transport. It's very rigid, and it's very, very, very smooth. So I don't have to have other sheets of paper behind my drawing sheet. If you're working on something a little rougher like this drawing board, even though they're smooth and they're made for drawing, I always suggest students work with 5 or 6 sheets of paper behind that, because otherwise you'll get a little bit of this deckled texture coming through your paper. Anyhow, so I've got my drawing board, I've got my paper taped to it. You can also use those binder clips as well. I do have a lamp, a little shop light clamped to my easel. I don't always work this way. In my own studio practice, I set up my lighting always differently depending on what I've got going on at the time. But in this case, because I want nice strong light on my objects, and I want the objects to be lit as much as possible by my source light, which is this spotlight, I want to make sure that the light on my drawing paper doesn't infiltrate and affect the really nice light effects I have going on up here, which is what my main focus for values is going to be right now. Light and shadow effects. Now, if I was to, in my studio, if I was going to open up these curtains and open up these big curtains here, then what would happen would be I would start to lose the effect on these lights and shadows. I'd still get them, but if I was to turn on my overhead lights here, my studio, the studio is rigged up with all these overhead lights as well. I have that big window mostly blocked out, but you'll see there's less of an effect. Now we have lots of different shadows happening, and the spheres look less dramatic, and it's harder to see some of the lighting effect. So as I shut these overhead lights down, the light and shadow effect feels cleaner, it's easier to see, and then of course as I start to close these drapes down, you'll see even greater sense of light and shadow. I also have these overheads on, which I can kill. And now you'll see an even nicer sense of light and shadow, which is really what we're after. As long as I can keep the light on my paper, I'm good to go. Now, again, it's hard to rig up your apartment like this, so do the best you can, but try to figure out a way where you can get at least one strong spotlight on your objects to get this nice sense of light and shadow. These lamps are super cheap. You can get them at Lowe's, Home Depot, whatever. They're little clamp lights. They're about $4 or $5 a piece. I've got probably a dozen of them. They're really useful, and you really only need one to light your objects. If you don't have one of those lights, you can use a regular clamp light for your bedstand or something like that, and take some tin foil, create a little bit of a dome like this, or just a really strong lamp with a lampshade facing in the direction of your objects. Whatever you do, try to light your objects with a very, very strong sense of light, direct light. Much easier to see the light and shadow effects that way. The problem with working with daylight, which is why it's sunny out today, but I have my drapes closed, because I want to try to regulate and control the light in my space so I have a really nice strong sense of light and shadow. Daylight coming in from all different directions would destroy that, plus If it's a really sunny day, the light will be changing as the sun changes and moves in the sky. So you'll have these lights, shadows, effects shifting. You'll have a tendency to have moving shadow shapes, which can make you a little crazy, especially as a beginning drawing student. Alrighty, so that's the setup. Again, if you don't have a piece of foam core or drawing board, try to find something to tape your paper to. I have only one piece of paper here, but make sure that if you're working on something a little rougher, use more paper to get a little bit thicker padding behind that drawing sheet so you're not getting the texture as you blend. Of course, I have a trash can nearby so I can sharpen my pencils into my trash can and I don't get my pencil shavings all over the room. Okay, so that's really about it as far as our setup. Let's get right into the demo. So really quickly, right before I get into the actual drawing, I want to point out a few things. This is generally more or less what I'm looking at from my point of view. So I want you to be aware of a few things. As I start to draw this, you see that little laser? These are the effects, and you'll see this in the PDFs, the handouts that I've included in your exercises and your assignments. But to see it from a real, live, actual object, it's a little different. So I want to point out these effects and the terminology that we want to be aware of as we're drawing. So the first thing we see is this highlight. Okay, that would be our highlight. That's the highest key value right there. So a slightly reflective object, and it's in relationship to our source light. Our source light comes down, and the angle relationship between the source light, the object it's bouncing off of, and our eyes is what creates this sense of highlight. Right outside of the highlight, right on the edge of that is our quarter tone. And that's where things start to get a little bit lower key value. A little bit lower key value. The highlight's going to be the highest key value on the object. Right here is our quarter tone. And as we squint, so squinting is going to be really helpful. Squint, 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 squint a lot. As we move outside of that, we start to see our transitions of value go from quarter tone right through here into our halftone. So the halftone is that transition right along that edge, that transition. You can see it, halftone, halftone, all through here. And that's going to be our transition from our direct source light to our indirect light, which is rolling around the form. And then you can see this beautiful dark stripe essentially right through almost the middle of the sphere. That's our core shadow. Our core shadow is going to be the darkest part of that object. Now, if we didn't have this object sitting on a plane that was reflective, or there was nothing around it, it was just floating in space, we would not see this beautiful effect here of reflected light. But since this is on a white object, this sphere is sitting on a white canvas, it's fairly reflective, it's bouncing light back into the body or the belly of that sphere. Now, if you see what happens as I bounce the light from the laser, it literally, you can see it bouncing right up into the body of the sphere. So that's essentially what's happening. It's the only difference is that the light's coming from a slightly different angle, slightly above, so that's why it's bouncing into this portion here. It's bouncing off of this area here, and then we see a little bit of a darker shadow under here where there's an absence of light right along the edge, the crease, but then we are dealing with our cast shadow. And here we have the penumbra, which is an effect we'll talk about in depth later. But we see essentially two shadows. We see the darker interior shadow of the penumbra, and then we see the lighter exterior shadow of the penumbra. We see it also in this area here. Keep in mind with cast shadows, they're not black holes in the middle of our canvas or paper. They're full of color. They're full of light. Even though there's a strong, solid object blocking that direct light, source light from casting here, there's still a lot of light bouncing in and out of that cast shadow. So you'll notice there's a lot more reflected light in this section of the cast shadow. This area of the penumbra is a little bit darker than this area. This is a little bit lighter. This area is a little lighter. We see the darkest part of the penumbra right here. And this area of the cast shadow is lighter. It gets a little bit darker as it drops back around the object. So watch for these effects. We also want to think about these ideas of edges, and we'll talk about edges as I start to draw. Notice that there's a black curtain behind, and we're having this interesting relationship of really stark contrast, high contrast value drawing. Dark, dark black background, white surface, and a sphere that's describing an entire range of high key values to middle key values to middle low key values to low key values. So keep that in mind, and we're going to get right into the drawing. So one thing I always like to discuss really at the beginning of this process of value drawing is the transition from what we've been working on up to this point, which has really been focused on line drawing, linear drawing. That transition from linear drawing to value drawing or tonal drawing can be a little daunting. It can be a little bit frightening sometimes and a little overwhelming. So I want to make this as clear as possible, but I also want to keep this demo fairly brief. I don't want to go much more than 10 or 15 minutes. The reason for doing this demo is to show you some basic approach. It's not the only way to approach this. There are thousands of ways to approach a value drawing. I mean, hundreds of thousands. This is one way. It's a simple way, and it seems to be the most effective for beginning students to really get a grasp of value, tone, and the materials, the charcoal. So I'm going to start with some Willow Charcoal, and one way you can approach this value drawing business is thinking about it purely tonally, and that means draw all of your objects without line, and that seems kind of counterintuitive based on what we've just been doing, which has been drawing totally with line. And that's usually described with just shapes of value. So you can describe a drawing objects without line, because as we look at real objects, we don't really see line. We see shapes of value that are butt up against other shapes of value that create this sense, this illusionary effect of objects in space in 3 dimensions based on light. Now, our goal is to create this illusion, of 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional object or 2-dimensional surface. Now, we can do this through just describing shapes of value. So you have a shape of value butt up against another shape of value, and you create the edge of one object in front of the space or another object. That's a little more challenging, so what I will have you guys do, or I would suggest that you do, is just start the drawing with a light line. Use simple objects. Make sure you light it with a good light source. To start with, simple objects to practice are better. They're easier to grasp. Find a soccer ball or a baseball or something like that, or eggs are really, really great to draw. And just light it with a strong light source and try to play around with a few different approaches before you go into your final drawing. You can start your drawing with a simple line. What I just showed you is a simple sphere in front of a dark background and a white surface, lit with a very strong singular spotlight. So what I'd like you to do is think about this as a value drawing, as a tonal drawing, but we'll start with a linear sketch. But as quickly as I can, I want to get rid of that line. I don't want to delineate or separate my objects from the space around them, or other objects, in fact, with line. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. We're also going to talk about edges, and I'll talk about those edge differences and how we deal with those, how we see them, and how we actually render them in a few moments as well. So I'm looking at this object. Let's just get right into it. I want to make sure that I'm working about life size. I'm working with my vine charcoal, or in this case, Willow Charcoal, and I'm just going to lightly sketch in where my object is. Now remember, if you can think back to the light source is coming in from this angle here. So as I look at my light source, I know that the top edge of this sphere is going to be very, very light against a dark background. So I'm going to come around, lightly sketch in the sphere, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to think about that cast shadow really quickly. I'm going to think about the shape and the dimensionality of that cast shadow. Where does that cast shadow intersect the sphere, and what are the angles of that cast shadow? Remember, I showed you the darker part of that cast shadow that's closest to the sphere, and on the outer side of that cast shadow we have that penumbra. So we'll deal with that in a second. But right now, again, this is just a linear drawing. I also might describe where that ground plane, or in this case a canvas, a white canvas, intersects that sphere, and it's right about there. It's just right at about midpoint. It's just slightly below midpoint of where that sphere is. So, and then the angle of that canvas comes up this way. So that's as much as I'm going to do as a linear depiction. The rest of this is going to be tonal. I might describe a little bit of where that highlight is going to be. My quarter tones are going to be down through here. Now I'm going to use the side of the charcoal to describe larger areas of value. I can see my half tones coming in around this angle, and then my core shadow comes in at a stronger angle this way. And then below that core shadow is my reflected light. Now already I'm starting to use my fingers to soften up some of that color, some of that value, and soften up some of the texture. I don't want to wait too long before I start to describe what's happening in the value of that cast shadow. So I'm going to go in really quickly and describe that cast shadow. And I remember, this is very loose, and I just want to get a suggestion. And I want to show you how quickly you can block in some general tones and some general value shapes. And by doing so fairly quickly, I can start to get the illusion of this sphere in space. Now, one of the things that students wait way too long to do is they might render the heck out of the sphere and the cast shadow really beautifully. Then they leave all this white back here, but what I'm seeing in reality is not a white cloth behind this white canvas. What I see is a very dark black cloth. It's going to be very difficult for me to evaluate the relationships of these values to these values and these values to these values if I wait too long to deal with this stuff behind this sphere. So I'm going to, right away, I'm going to go in and start to describe the value of that background relatively quickly, because by doing so, right away, I can create, again, this illusion of that space behind my sphere, and without a whole lot of effort, suddenly I'm getting that sphere that's popping off of that background. And that's a really important lesson in this, is the relationships of the values within this object are so much dependent on what's happening around that object. So keep that in mind as you're drawing. Now right away you start to see this illusion. So I want to keep going. Remember, this charcoal is really, really, really delicate. Just by touching it with my finger, I lift it up off the paper. So when blowing on it, you know, I lose about 1 to 2% of that value just by blowing on. So I'll go back to that in a minute, and I want to talk about these ideas of edges in a moment as well. So you'll notice I've been using my fingers to blend. At the early stages, I really like to use my hands because it's loose. I like to get into it. I like to move the charcoal around. I'm not thinking too much about really overly stating details. Right now, I want you to a couple things I want you to start to think about. Now, let's say I get a little bit of charcoal there. You know, your eraser is very powerful at this point because the charcoal is very light. Don't bear down, don't make your marks too heavy right now. Just keep it really light. As I start to get the drawing somewhat sketched in, now I can start thinking more specifically about the value transitions in this sphere from my highlight to my quarter tones to my half tones to my core shadow down into my reflected light. Now, what I want you to start to think about as well as you're doing this is edges. Edges are one of the most elusive, one of the most challenging, one of the most tricky things that painters, drawers, artists can deal with. They are troublesome to a lot of artists. If you can start thinking about those this early on in your process, you're way ahead of the game. So let me write this down. I want you to think about these things. There are 4 different kinds of edges. All right, 4 different kinds of edges. So keep this in mind. Your 4 different kinds of edges are sharp, hard, soft, and lost. Edges are what happens when you have one object in front of another object, or where you have an object in front of space. Edges also occur where form is turning and you have light transitioning. These transitions from halftone from quarter tone to halftone to core shadow to reflected light, these transitions are edges. Right now, this edge is much too hard. What I see in reality is a much softer edge. The transition of that light source is very soft. Now I can soften it with my finger, I can soften it with a stump if I really want to get a little bit more into the blending, and I'll show you how to really use these stumps a little bit later. But these edges are going to be softer. And the nice thing about the charcoal is it's very, very, very malleable. You can change it, you can work it. If I want this, I notice that there's a higher key value coming in under here when there's reflected light bouncing up off the table. If I decide that I've made that too dark, I can simply go in with my kneaded eraser and I can erase some of that up. But again, I don't want to go too crazy with my erasers yet. I want to continue to build up some of this value to try to get an accurate relationship, an accurate representation of the relationships of the darkest value on my drawing to the lightest value, which would be that highlight. The light plane of this table or this canvas on the ground plane is pretty comparable to the highlight. So that and that, those areas are the lightest key, highest key values. The darkest value, the lowest key value is this cloth. The second darkest value would be right along the base of this sphere. Now I've made that a very strong value, but the nice thing about the charcoal is you can go in and you can lighten it, you can soften it, you can blend it, and it becomes a little bit more convincing as you soften it and blend it. The other really beautiful thing about charcoal is that it is really, really versatile in terms of push and pull, push and pull. I want you to think of these ideas of add and subtract. We have our additive process, which is literally taking the charcoal and putting it down on the paper. That's additive. Blending it can oftentimes be subtracted, because a lot of times by blending it, you're actually lifting that charcoal up off the canvas and moving it to another place, so it tends to lighten things up a little bit. I'm going to soften this transition up into the highlight through the quarter tones. We have a little bit more of a quarter tone as it rolls around into that far side of the sphere. So subtractive now, we've been working additive. If I decide I want to lift up some of this line that I put, because I don't like that line, I can use my eraser. This is subtractive. I'm subtracting now, I'm pulling the charcoal up. If I pull too much up, I can go back in and add some with my finger. For example, I might not want to have this dark of a value there. I can simply go in with my eraser and lighten that up. That's a subtractive method. Now I'm looking at the relationship again. This is all relationships. The table behind the sphere is much lighter than the sphere itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and darken that. But by darkening this, I'm now realizing, and again, I want to try to get rid of this line as a delineation, that terminating edge. This is a good term for you guys. The terminator, or the terminating edge of that sphere is darker than the surface behind it, but it's not described by a line. The terminating edge is described by a value, the value of the sphere that is darker than the value of the space behind it. You can go back in and restate the shape of that sphere by darkening up that value behind it. All right. So now as we start to look a little bit more closely at the shape of the sphere, I can also start thinking about edges. So soft, lost, hard. Where's the hardest, sharpest edge? The sharpest edge, generally speaking, sharpest edges, not always, but generally speaking, are where we see our highest contrasts. The highest contrast in this drawing are in three places. What I see is this edge, the separation of the surface of that ground plane, in this case canvas, to that background. That's a pretty sharp, that's a pretty hard edge. I wouldn't say it's sharp. It's somewhere between this and this. It's a sharp, hard edge. But what I see as a sharp edge is that edge right at the top of the sphere. So I want to go in and really clean that up. Sharpen that edge. And it's pretty sharp all the way around. So again, I want to get rid of the idea of describing that with line, and I want to describe that with one value hitting another value. Now as I lose a little bit of that drawing, I can, meaning the shape, not a problem. I'm not trying to be super crazy accurate in terms of the shape of my sphere yet. I can go back in and clarify that in a few moments. Some of it has to do with bringing the top plane down a little bit, the top of that sphere down a little bit, and looking at how that starts to smooth out that sphere. I can use my finger to lightly lift some of that charcoal up, but that's a really high key value right along that edge. So I'm going to go in with my kneaded eraser, and I'm going to just lightly, quickly, again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this demo, but I'm going to just lift up some of that charcoal and get a sense of that edge, which is a sharp edge, but it's also a high key value. And I'm going to go back in with a little blending because it's not as light or high key value as what I see right here in my highlight. The highlight is right here, and there's a nice technique you can use with your blending stump where I can pick up a bit of charcoal down here and I can blend that and I can bring that around very lightly and start to blend that into that space around that highlight, because there is a bit of a quarter tone around here, and if it's becoming a little bit too hard edged, again, I can blend it out with my finger, or I can even go in and use my eraser to blend it a little bit. Erasers can be used as blending tools as well as erasing tools, depending on how you use them. So I'm going to just soften this transition up around here. And now I have a hard, sharp edge. I have a hard edge, but it's not quite sharp. And what happens here now is as the value of the background and the value of that core shadow are close, they're not exact, but they're similar, I have, when I squint, I have almost a lost edge. The value of the core shadow of that sphere is almost the same value as that background. So I'm going to bring that right up, and as you start to think about lost edges, what's happening is that that sort of goes right up into that space, and it's just a tiny little bit lighter than, see that finger just lifted all that value up. We're still dealing with such a delicate medium right now. This soft willow charcoal is so delicate. That core shadow lightens as it comes around towards the light. And then I'm going to go in through here. Now, one of the things also is I want to get my transition a little bit softer as it comes across into that halftone. I'll add a little bit of charcoal and start to blend it with my finger. Again, I can use my stump to blend. I can use my finger, I can use Q-tips. I want to get a little bit more strength to the darks back here. Oops. And so in order to do so, I'm going to start to introduce some of my compressed charcoal in a minute. I'm going to clear up some issues I'm having with this edge down here. This is a little bit higher key value of the reflected light in the sphere, and it's a little bit darker in the cast shadow to create a little bit higher contrast in that transition there. So I want to do that, and that's also going to create a little bit of a harder edge because of the nature of the contrasting values. So I'm going to do that, and I'm losing the shape of the sphere a little bit. I'm not too worried about that because I'm going to go back in and restate that. The other place that you'll see edges is on the outside of the cast shadow. So rule of thumb, there's always an exception to every rule, but the rule of thumb is that the edges will generally be sharper, harder, closer to the object that's casting that shadow. So these edges closer to the sphere will be a little bit harder. As those edges move away from the sphere, as that cast shadow moves away from the sphere, the edges will be a little softer. What we see here, though, is a lot lighter value on this part of the sphere. And I also want to adjust the drawing of that shadow with my eraser. So here I'm using my eraser as a drawing tool to reshape and restate the shape of that cast shadow. I also want to elongate the shape of that shadow further out in space to describe that penumbra effect we were talking about. I'm going to go further out here, describe that, and adjust that drawing of that a little bit. Now as I hit it with the eraser off, I can see that my edge is sharpening. I want to soften that edge. I can do that with my finger, I can do that with my stump, I can do it with a combination. So I'm really working quickly here because I don't want this demo to drag on, but I want you to have a general idea of how you can manipulate this material and how you can manipulate the surface as well. So get a little bit more of that edge softening. And there's a little bit of a harder edge here. Now, I feel like at this point I've pushed my Willow Charcoal about as far as I want to push it. And I feel like I'm almost ready to bring out the big guns. I want to start to bring out my charcoal pencils, my compressed charcoal, because I can really get in and restate some of those stronger values. I want to make the marks a little bit more permanent, and I want to make the edges in some cases a little stronger. So this can be cleaned up with my eraser. That shape will be restated with a little bit of that reflected light coming up underneath the belly of that sphere. So by erasing that and just really adjusting the shape of that, I'm also introducing a little bit more accuracy into what's happening in that nice reflected light underneath the sphere. So again, I'm not going for total accuracy right now. I'll get a little bit more accurate towards the end of the demo with those charcoal pencils, but again, I'm just really sort of blocking in the general stuff. I'm not trying to go crazy with specifics yet. One other thing I want you to think about is working large to small or general to specific. So I want you to be thinking again, work large shapes to small shapes, also known as general to specific. So notice I haven't really been going crazy with detail. I'm not worried too much about, details, specifics. You want to be specific with your drawing, meaning you want to be accurate, but you don't want to be really crazy and wrapped up in overly specific, overly detailed things too soon, because you have a long way to go, and You want to be flexible and loose with your drawing in order to keep things alive as you're working through it. Make changes on the fly. If you're locked into something too soon, then oftentimes you start to you can run the risk of losing the life in it. So this edge can be a little softer because it's a little bit further back in space, and there's a little bit of a value back there. So what I see is that the edge of that sphere, I'm going to use my finger, and the edge of that sphere coming in front of that table is darker than the table all the way through that turn. So what separates this form from that form, again, is not a line, but it's a change of value. Right through this space, I'm going to use my blending stump. I'm going to put a little charcoal on the tip of it, and I'm going to go in and draw lightly with my blending stump and just darken the edge of that sphere just ever so subtly. And by darkening the edge of that sphere, it's going to pull away from the table. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side with the eraser. I'm going to go in and erase a little bit of the value of that table to pull out the sphere from that table. So I want to have a little bit darker edge along that sphere, but as I squint and I look at these objects in reality, I see there's a lot of reflected light bouncing around in here. So I'm not going to go crazy with detail right now for you guys, but I want to go a little bit closer. The value of that sphere is a little bit closer to the value of the background right in that area, but then it gets pretty brightened through here too. I'm going to soften that transition a little bit. And I think that reflective light, the lighter you touch your paper with your eraser, the less value you will lift up. So your eraser can become a very subtle drawing tool as well. And I noticed that the reflected light is less subtle in through here. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to add some value and then just soften it up with my finger to bring that into the dark side of that sphere. There's still reflected light. Not as much as what I see right there though. And I feel like if I want to lighten it up a little bit, I'll go in with a little bit of an erasing back and forth, just very lightly. And then a little bit lighter along the body of that edge. And then I'll use my stump again to come in and just soften that transition ever so subtly. So, you can start to see how this adds up. Now, again, I don't want to go too long. I think I've been going for about 20 minutes maybe. I want to end the demo in a minute or two, but I do want to end on a couple of notes here. I told you I would bring out the big guns, so let's start to look at our compressed charcoal. What I want to do is think about the darkest areas are right in here. So my compressed charcoal, again, I'm going to use my pencils. This happens to be a 4B, and I'm going to come in. You see, even just blowing on the paper, a lot of that charcoal just goes off into the air. But I want to go in and clarify some of this form. Once I put that charcoal down, I'm going to go pretty dark, and I want to really blast in some of those darks. And hopefully you can see this in the video, but that's really quite a bit darker than the willow that I just put down. I want to go as dark as I can get this charcoal. As dark as I can get it, which is really the darkest thing I see in that composition. Alright, so as you see this happening, you'll start to see again the sharpest edge in my drawing is generally right around here. Now, here's a nice place to use this little mechanical eraser. If I want to get very specific, I can go in and just clean up that edge a little bit. Very nice for those little fine details. I don't think the value is quite that light along the edge, so I'm going to go with my stump. Keep the sharp edge, but darken that value just a bit. I want to go right up to the edge of that form. And I'm going to continue along the edge of this sphere right around to that shadow side. The edge is a little softer on this edge here because we have the sphere itself is a little bit darker in value on that side. So the edge is going to be a bit softer. Still a hard edge, but not a sharp edge. So I'm going to bring that value right around. And I can still blend that as well if I want to. Meaning if I have too much texture in those marks, I can go with my blending stump and I can blend it down so I lose some of that texture. Remember, keep this in mind though, remember as you're blending, you're pushing that charcoal or graphite, whatever you're using, into the fibers of the paper. So remember, as you're blending, the more you blend, the more difficult it's going to be to lift up and erase that charcoal. So be wary of that. Be cautious, be careful, have fun, take chances, but just keep in mind if you are in a place where you want to erase a bunch of stuff and you can't get it up off the paper, that's probably what happened. You either pushed too hard with the pencil or you blended so much that you just blended it right down into the fiber. So again, I'm not going to go crazy and try to get this a perfect sphere. If I had a few more moments, I could refine some of the shape up here, but my point with this is to give you guys a bit of a demonstration on how to use the charcoal, but also just as importantly, how to create a tonal drawing instead of a linear drawing. I'm going to go in and just clean up that edge a little bit with my Kneaded Eraser. And there's a little bit of a light halo right on the edge of that, which is sort of nice. I want to try to describe that. This mechanical eraser here. A little bit. There we go. And I'm going to soften up that transition right here, and then I'm going to do a couple more things in the shadow, and we'll be done. But I want you to keep in mind the idea of this push and pull. Push and pull, meaning if I put too much charcoal down by accident, I can simply lift it back up. In many cases, sometimes, again, if you go too dark and you really bear down on it, you might be stuck with what you have, and it's going to be hard to lift it up. So, but charcoal is very, very, very flexible. It's very malleable. If your stump gets too dirty, you can use your Kneaded Eraser and lift up some of the charcoal. And I want to go through here and maybe make this a little bit darker along that edge to really make that highlight stand out. Now it might be a little too dark. Simply go back in with my eraser, lighten it up. Now I'm starting to get a little bit more sense of the form turning around that sphere, and we'll be done in just a minute. And what I'm seeing is this. So we have our highlight right about here. We have our quarter tones. It's a little bit too dark, but I'll just go in and lift it. Quarter tones right around that half tone. I'm going to soften that edge a little bit with my eraser. And these half tones can be a little bit lighter, but as they go from, again, these are our quarter tones. And this is a much softer transition up into that, from the highlight to the quarter tone. Softer transitions all around. And then I have from my quarter tones, get rid of some of that texture here. smooth that out with my eraser. And then a little bit smooth this out into those halftones here. Using my stump and my finger. And now I'm just about closing in on being done here. Continuously modeling and changing my edges, adjusting how hard or soft the edges are based on the value transitions. This is a little bit lighter in that, in that reflected light area. And this is a little bit lighter through here too, so light erasing. So we start to see this thing take shape a little bit. As I squint down, I notice that this area here can be a tiny little bit darker. It doesn't reflect. Reflected light is pretty strong here because of the white surface, but not quite this strong. So very light pressure with that stump, and I can get some of that darker value to show up. Okay, so with my pencil, I can go in and you know, clarify some of these little areas if I want to get in. Now this would be considered detail. If I want to really go in and describe some of that, maybe I overshot it a little bit, so I can go with my eraser and pull up some of that value a little bit. And I had charcoal on my finger, but this whole area back here is a little bit darker, so I want to bring some of that darker value back there. Here I can lighten it up. And what I see also then is a little bit darker right along the sphere there. Using my stump, I'm going to go in and just erase a little bit of that linear edge. A little bit subtler here. Almost a lost edge. Not quite, but when I squint, it's almost a lost edge, meaning the edge of the sphere is almost the same exact value as the table behind it. But the sphere is still a little bit darker right there. Alright, so that's the general gist. That's the basic idea. Now, as I look at it, I can say, well, I want to go in and restate some of the shape of the shadow, and I can do so with my eraser to get a little bit more of a convincing sense of that shadow wrapping around behind the sphere. And as I do that, the penumbra actually starts to become more apparent in my drawing, which is sort of nice. And I can also use this as an opportunity to go back in with another charcoal pencil. Why don't I use, this is a little bit harder pencil, I'm going to use an HB, and I'm going to go in and I'm just going to start to go in and, much harder pencil, and I want to kind of go in and clarify some of the darker shadow edge right under there. Soften that transition a little bit. There we go. And a little bit lighter here, which will also help clarify that form. And then I'm going to go in with that HB pencil and just lightly, very so lightly on the side of the pencil, go in and darken up. I'm feeling that this might be a little bit too hard for what I want, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to go for a 4B. I'm going to use a 3B. So it's a little bit softer, and it allows a little bit darker and a little bit more blending in that dark range, just to get a little bit of sense of that darkness right against that sphere into the cast shadow. Alrighty, so that, I think I've covered most everything I wanted to cover. We've talked about edges, we've talked about sort of the idea. This has been about 30-minute drawing. Now I maybe drew a little bit longer than I had intended, but I wanted to give you all sort of a sense of how to build this up. This is one approach of many approaches, but what I'd like you to do is play around, have some fun with this. I'm gonna take my camera here off the tripod, and I want to just kind of go over and remind you guys of what we were looking at to begin with. So here's the drawing, and as we go and we look, we're looking at the sphere, we sort of see the effects I was after, just as a reminder. Highlight, halftone, we get the highlight up on the left, quarter tone, halftone, core shadow, nice reflected light, and as we back out we see the sphere, and so that's it. Now if I had another 10 or 15 minutes, I would continue to possibly refine some of the shape of this, absolutely refine some of the edges, and really get more of a sphere happening. But that's pretty much what I wanted to show you. Keep in mind the edges, sharp, hard, soft, lost. Work large to small, also known as general to specific, big shapes to small shapes. And that's it. I hope you learned a little bit, hope you had fun, and I look forward to seeing your drawing soon.